Hello, my name is Jordan Bodnick, and today I will be on the government side for the motion. This House believes an international system with two or more superpowers is better for developing countries than an international system with a single superpower. My time starts now. Imagine if you were Rwanda in 1994. Your country is in a state of crisis. You need military support, humanitarian aid, and protection through the UN. Under the unipolar system, you get no protection or help. The US, the dominating superpower at the time, it completely ignored UN pleas. Your country descends into genocide. Now, imagine that same crisis under multipolarity, where the US, China, and Russia all compete for influence in East Africa. Each superpower wants influence over Rwanda, so they fight in the UN to back you to prevent the others from gaining control. Within these institutions, you have leverage, you don't get abandoned. To protect countries like Rwanda, I am proud to affirm the motion that an international system supports developing countries better under a multipolar system. To start, I will begin with definitions. We define a superpower as a state with military, economic, and political power to shape international outcomes independently. In the status quo, the US and China are clear examples. We define developing countries as nations with below average GDP per capita, limited institutional capacity, and importantly, historical dependence on external powers. In the status quo, examples include large portions of Africa, parts of the Middle East, Latin America, etc. We define international organizations as global institutions established by a treaty. Examples include the UN, IMF, and World Bank. We define a unipolar system as power concentrated in one superpower that dominates institutions. For example, after the Cold War, the US was a singular dominating superpower. We define a multipolar system as power distributed across multiple superpowers competing for influence within international institutions. In the status quo, the USA, China, and Russia all compete for influence and power across these organizations. Next, I will introduce our framework and model. We support a multipolar international system where power is distributed across multiple superpowers. The US, China, Russia, and emerging powers. They all compete for the influence of the developing nations within international organizations. Our principle is simple. Developing countries can only build independent futures if they have genuine choice and leverage within international organizations. Our principle is twofold. First of all, when one superpower dominates institutions, it creates power imbalances. When multiple superpowers compete, it creates checks and balances. Secondly, we judge systems based on structural incentives. A system where superpowers must negotiate with developing countries is better than one where they can ignore them, regardless of which leader is in charge. We measure this on three main metrics. First of all, agency and voice in institutions. Developing countries can make independent choice without fear of getting punished or reprimanded. Secondly, economic opportunity. Developing countries can access alternative institutions that negotiate better terms. They're not trapped in one singular system. Thirdly, institutional influence. Developing countries have leverage in shaping institutional rules, and they have legitimate negotiating power. The burden in the affirmative is to prove that multipolarity is comparatively better to unipolarity by the three metrics we provide you. The burden in the opposition is to prove that unipolarity is better than the three metrics, or to argue that our framework and model is false. With that being said, contention one for the government is multipolarity gives developing countries institutional voice. Multipolarity gives developing countries leverage with institutions by allowing them to appeal to competing superpowers who want to undercut their rival. Unipolarity silences developing nations' voice. Under unipolarity, the superpower completely dominates decision-making. Developing countries can vote, but the superpower can ignore them because no one else will back them, or they are afraid of upsetting the superpower. When the superpower wants to push through policy in the UN Security Council, IMF Board, or WTO, developing countries' votes do not matter. They are subject judges, not participants. What happens if the developing countries rebels? They are subject to trade blocks, tariffs, or forced isolation. However, under multipolarity, developing countries gain actual power. They form voting blocs that swing outcomes. If a superpower tries to marginalize them, they appeal to the competing superpower for backing. That competitor has an incentive to support the developing nation. Look to our introduction in the Rwanda example to gain influence and undermine the rival. Now developing countries have negotiating power. For some examples, in the post-Cold War unipolarity Iraq War, the US wanted to invade Iraq. The UN General Assembly voted against the invasion. Developing countries within the institutions voiced isolation and inevitably had no power shifting the result. The US ignored the institution entirely and invaded anyway. By 2003, developing countries' influence over UN outcomes had dropped 52% compared to the Cold War. Secondly, let's look to the emerging status quo multipolarity in the UN. As China rises as a competing superpower, developing countries regain leverage. A 2023 UN study found developing countries now pass 61% of their sponsored resolutions because China courts their votes. The impact is an increase in voice. Multipolarity gives developing countries legitimate decision-making and leverage. Our second contention is multipolarity gives developing countries access to alternative institutional frameworks. Multipolarity allows developing countries to access alternative institutions outside of superpower-dominated ones. We want to characterize that staying in one superpower can often be economically bad for a developing nation, and it is incredibly helpful if a developing nation can access alternative frameworks. Under unipolarity, a developing nation cannot, because under unipolarity, the superpower and its allies control major institutions. In the IMF, World Bank, WTO, the superpower sets the rules. Developing countries need capital or trade, so they accept these rules or get excluded. Look to intention 1 and the example I showed you of the consequences of the developing nation rebelling. The rules benefit the superpower and their citizens, not developing nations. However, under multipolarity, competing superpowers can create alternative institutions to win developing countries' allegiance. A country locked out of IMF lending can access Chinese development banks. Developing countries can pick frameworks that work for them instead of being forced into one system. For some examples, let's look at the Cold War multipolarity state. India rejected the IMF and World Bank. It built a state-led economy with Soviet backing, public development banks, state enterprises, and alternative trade agreements. When the Cold War ended and unipolarity took over, India lost Soviet institutions and was forced to accept IMF World Bank rules in the 1990s against its preferences. This was incredibly economically harmful to India. Secondly, let's look at the status quo multipolarity. Vietnam rejected exclusive reliance on U.S. institutions like the TPP. It instead accessed Chinese frameworks such as the Belt and Road and alternative development banks while still having access to regional trade agreements. Vietnam now has institutional diversity and negotiating leverage. The impact is when developing countries choose institutional frameworks that work for them, not what maximizes superpower profit, they're able to economically grow and break the chain of dependency between them and the superpower. Under unipolarity, they're forced into one system that benefits outside investors. Multipolarity lets them access institutions that serve their own citizens, Judge. To conclude, under unipolarity, developing countries are subjects of institutions. The superpower dictates rules. They have no voice, no alternative, no leverage. However, under multipolarity, developing countries become strategic actors. Superpowers need to compete for their support. They can negotiate, they can choose. At the point where developing nations break the chain of dependency between themselves and the superpowers and legitimately economically grow, I'm so proud to affirm. Thank you.